Good evening and warm welcome to all the participants. We are getting ready to start the 196th session of WiseViews Leadership Conversations. Ladies and gentlemen, we are fortunate to have Mr. Dhirendra Pratap Singh, who has joined from the US. Welcome, Mr. Dhirendra Pratap Singh. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure,
Great.
Mr. Roy.
Here is a very young and dynamic social change maker with us. And this evening should be highly motivating and inspiring for all of us who are seeing him and who are going to interact with him as well. So without much ado, I take this opportunity to introduce Mr. Dhirendra Pratap Singh. I'll share my screen. So these are WiseViews Leadership Conversations, which we have been hosting over the last 3.5 to 4 years now. And every single Friday, we host these learning sessions for leaders who are aspiring leaders, learners, teachers, everyone put together. So this is session number 196. The topic for today is Girls' Growth in Global South, Why Gender Equity is Everyone's Fight. This will be led by Mr. Dhirendra Pratap Singh. And so this talk and the introduction will be for about 20-25 minutes. And after that, there's a 40 minutes of a Q&A that we have. So this is Mr. Dhirendra Pratap Singh. He is the co-founder and CEO of Milaan Foundation, and which is a non-profit working towards educating, enabling, and empowering children and youth in rural communities. Mr. Dhirendra also co-founded the impact venture Azadi Incorporation in 2012, which now works to create menstruation-friendly schools under Milaan in rural Uttar Pradesh of India. Previously, he has had several successful forays developing strategy and scaling operations for organizations within the development sector. This included acting as the managing trustee of Vidya Grants India, which is a subsidiary of Vidya Grants Foundation USA. And during his time at Vidya, he launched and scaled their operations in India. Recognizing Mr. Dhirendra's work, various national and international organizations such as Oxfam International, Pravah, Ashoka, Action for India, 100org, and the International Peace Foundation have honored him with awards or fellowships. He has earned a master's in development studies from Amity University and earned a bachelor's in mathematics honors from the University of Delhi. Wonderful, Mr. Dhirendra. Once again, thank you. Thank you for joining us. I will also introduce my esteemed colleague, Dr. Prasad. Dr. R. Prasad is the Senior Director at Academic Wing of ICFAI Group. He brings 3 decades of rich experience to the table as an entrepreneur, as a corporate professional, and now as a distinguished academic at ICFAI Group. He holds BTech from IIT Bombay and PGDM from IIM Kolkata. Welcome to you as well, Professor Prasad. We are all set to hear from you, Mr. Dhirendra, and we want to understand the details and the drama that is involved in creating this change. No change happens by accident. It happens by concerted effort, and efforts involve a lot of stories, and we would like to understand those stories from you. Over to you, Mr. Dhirendra, and thank you so much once again. I welcome all the participants to stay glued and keep noting down so that we have Q&A towards the end, which can be very interactive. Thank you all.
Thank you, Mr. Roy, for the kind introduction. You've been very generous with your words, and I really appreciate this. Good morning, good evening, everybody. It's a privilege to be here among some very sharp minds and future leaders. I was told by Mr. Roy that the majority of the audience here, come with a work ex between 8 to 10 years, and I think and a group like this is really full of allies, change makers, bridge builders, who, like me, actually believe in the power of young people to lead us towards a more just and equal world. As I was introduced, my name is Dhirendra. I lead Milaan Foundation, a nonprofit which is committed to empowering adolescent girls in some of the most under-resourced and rural parts of India. We also do some international work, but I think for this conversation, I wanted to kind of focus on the work that we're doing in India. And building the narrative around the topic, which is the girls' growth and gender equity. And I think one of the major things that I want to emphasize in this conversation today, that gender equity is not a charity issue. It's not just a CSR issue. It's not a non-profit issue. It's actually a growth issue. And in this conversation today, I'm going to give both maths and the stories around why this is actually a leadership issue and with an economic imperative. in a nutshell, it is everybody's fight. Before I get into numbers, I wanted to kind of build a story to kind of help you understand where we come from. Right? So I want to share the story of Roshni. Roshni is a 15-year-old that lives in a small village in Sitapur. In a family of 8, her family, come from an agricultural background. They make approximately, let's say, about $3 a day. And if you look at Roshni's stories, it might sound very common, but it's actually the story of millions and millions of girls in India. India is home to about 120 million adolescent girls. That's almost 1/3 of the size of the population of the US, right? In that one, and majority of these adolescent girls actually live in rural India, which further creates challenges and systematic exclusion in their own growth story. The girls land up performing about 5 to 7 times more domestic labor than boys. What does that really mean? That means is they drop out of the school earlier. Their access to healthcare is limited. They become child brides. The data shows that almost 40% adolescent girls in India don't complete secondary education. 1 in 4 get married before the legal age of 18, making India the home to the largest number of child brides in the world. And I think the question that we have to ask ourselves as we look at these numbers is that we have one India, which is growing and I think recently became the 4th largest economy in the world. And then we have an India, which is I think a lot of people use the combination between an India and a Bharat, and literally like a Bharat, where we are still home to the largest number of child brides. Think about what it happens or what it does to a girl who's a 14-year-old get married there. And these are government numbers. These are not numbers that we've come up with our own research. So if you look at the National Family Welfare Survey of 2022, you'll get some of these numbers from districts. It's also interesting is that as the Hyderabad, the Delhi, the Bombay, the Bangalore of the country is growing, these numbers are actually coming from the rural parts of the countries of the states like UP and places like Sitapur and Azamgarh and Bareilly and the aspirational district the government is talking about, right? But at the same time, when we look at these numbers, I think at the same time, the question we need to ask ourselves from a very economics perspective also is saying, why do we need to invest into it, right? And one thing is that it's a good thing to do, it's the right thing to do, and there's one narrative around it. But I did promise an economic narrative. I'm just putting out some very, very specific data, right? Like the World Bank says that every girl in the world completes 12 years of schooling, which is the most common thing most of us will wish for our children, right? Like we want them to do masters and graduation and this and that. But the bare minimum, we was like, let's clear class 12th. If every girl in the world does that, it adds about $30 trillion to the global economy, which is almost the economy of the US, And to give you a perspective, India's GDP is about $4 trillion. So if you just look at the economic impact, it'll just add, right? Even just ending things like child marriage is going to add about $500 billion annually to the world. Life expectancies goes up. An educated girl there's more probability for her to educate her children. It just changes the entire dynamic of the world we live in. And I think then the question comes into is that we know the problem. We know what will happen or what could happen when we solve the problem. Then why are we not solving the problem at the speed and the pace that we need, right? This is not a problem that needs a very that needs a technology which has not been developed, or it needs a heavy level of financing. I think it also needs the fact that, how do we drive our attention to the larger problem and think about how do we solve it? Which is where organizations like Milaan come in, right? We started in 2007, so we are an 18-year-old organization working with and for adolescent girls in some of the rural parts of the country, as I talked about in my introduction. And organizations like Milan, I think they're asking us very fundamental questions within the communities of saying, how do we get communities to invest in girls as they invest in their own voice, right? At the grassroots level, how do we challenge those social norms? How do we drive that discussion, right, within the community? Because unless you change that mindset, nothing much is going to move. And something that we've seen in Milan's work is like, as we were asking this larger research question, I'm saying, how does that change it, right? Because we've seen the government building such massive amount of schools within the country. And therefore, the girls' education rate has definitely gone up. But we also know from our work that just because there's a school in a community doesn't guarantee that the girl is going to come to the school. Right? And so what is that barrier is to understand. And to our understanding, that barrier is the gender regressive social norms and our own mindsets of how do we perceive girls' education or just girls in our own life, right? Which is where the larger question of gender equity comes into. In many of the interviews, it's very interesting. I was reading this and I'm going a bit off track, I know, but I was actually listening to Javed Akhtar, and he made a very, very valid point that a lot of us actually give a credit of our success to our mothers. But at what time you become, right? How do you define that stage in life, and and how does that differentiate? And we still have a large number of girls in this country, or women, girls and women in this country who are not supported from the growth perspective. Stepping back and saying, like, how does Milan do it, right? And I think the whole idea for us was saying, how do we break barriers? How do we create spaces for girls to explore their full potential? And one of the things we looked at was basically creating a network of role models. Something like, just to kind of connect, something like ICFAI is trying to do with these series, right? Like what you're trying to do is to kind of bring in leaders from across the world to kind of talk about what works, what doesn't work, and really kind of challenge the barriers and help working professionals to think about what is possible. And similarly, taking this thing to the rural communities, when we kind of building a network of girls as role models, we're trying to show communities what is possible when you invest in girls, right? And I know sometimes it's very difficult to imagine villages where not a single girl has ever cleared class 10. In a village like that, when you talk about girls becoming engineers, they don't know what it means, right? And I think and then if you're able to support a girl to become a software engineer, it actually creates a pathway for many other girls to say, if she can do it, then I can do it. And I think that's the reason where we build these network of role models, and we've built over 5,000 girl leaders as role models in about 5,000 villages across 3 states in India. We also believe that in today's world, technology is power, right? And access to technology not only opens your access to information, but it actually opens access to many, many doors. And therefore, how do we make sure that we are able to not only provide access to technology to these girls, but use technology as a mechanism for them to be open doors? Simultaneously, I think as we're talking about building role models, giving access to technology, it's also important for them to continue their education. And we do life skills. We use life skills as a mechanism, as a pedagogy to kind of build their skills, preparing them for jobs. But as we're looking at like their own well-being, their own career orientation, their own pathways, to kind of really understand who I want to be. And as we work with girls, I think it's also important to understand that you can't work with girls in isolation. You have to work with an entire community. So we work with the local government, we work with local stakeholders to make sure that the girls are provided with the ecosystem they need to grow and prosper. These are methodologies that Milan has kind of used to work with over 100,000 girls over the last 18 years. And we have definitely seen some unprecedented impact of the work that we have done. The model has been evaluated by third parties, including UC Berkeley, Michigan State University, the Variant Group, and we're seeing that in the geographies we are working, we were able to bring down school dropout rates from 40% that I talked about initially to less than 5%. We were able to bring down child marriages rates to less than 1% in the communities we work, right? And when you're looking at these percentages, also kind of just keep in mind that they're not just percentages, they're representative of millions and millions of girls. And in our case, for example, with our capacities, hundreds and thousands of girls. And that's every girl has a story. There is a power to look at, right? And I started with Roshni's story, and I think we just bring down now that Roshni's now kind of preparing to go to college. She wants to be a lawyer. And I think that's the difference this comes into. Our model is fairly simple. I think besides the technical term that we kind of talked about was when we work in villages, we identify girls who have the potential to be girl leaders. We support them, build their capacities, take them through a leadership program. These girls are then called as girl icons. And then every girl mobilizes about 20 more girls in her own community, forms a peer group, supports them with various information that they need. And then these girls come together towards the mid of the program to identify an issue and develop a solution in the issue. And it could be a campaign around child marriage, it could be a campaign around creating awareness around menstrual health, or as simple as like simple but yet complex about how do I get the washrooms in my school opened, right? Because many schools don't have washrooms for girls, or if they had, there's a complexities around usability of those. That's broadly what Milan's work has been. I wanted to kind of also bring in some qualitative, thoughts from the girls that we worked in, right? Like, so for example, Lakshmi from Karnataka said, my fate was sealed from a very young age. I was to be a child bride. There was no escaping from child marriage in my community. When I joined the Milan's program, I realized that I could change my destiny. Now, I am the only other girl in my village to complete secondary education. And as I talked about the fact we work with village heads, and you see like, Sushma, who's a social worker, says many girls used to sit idle and leave schools. Overcoming these challenges with help of Milan has ensured that they have been enrolled in our school. Our work has been kind of captured across various media. And I think it's very important to talk about the fact, because it's important to talk about these issues so that we don't forget that we are leaving a Bharat behind, and specifically girls who are one of the most vulnerable demographics in these places, but still very powerful and leaders of change to work with. Some of the partners that we work with, Obama Foundation has captured the model as one of the most impactful models that should be looked at investing into girls in their annual report. We work with the Ford Foundation, Global Giving, Belden. These are just kind of some State Street, a couple of corporates and companies that we kind of work with. I'm going to, and I think as we talk about our work, I'm also going to give you a bit of a larger picture to step out, right? Like just as a group to think about that there are organizations like Milan, which is working on the grassroots. But when you look at the larger issue, right, like we talked about gender equity. So for example, SDG 5, the Social Development Goal 5, talked about gender equality. And a recent report by a group called as Equal Measures says that not even a single country on the planet is actually on the track to meet the gender equality goal by 2030. And we're talking about across. And therefore, there's fundamental questions comes into saying, why is this not happening? And one of the major reasons is that I don't think we are investing enough into the space, right? So the Women Philanthropic Institute says that less than 2% of the global donations goes to women and girls causes. Less than 2%, right? They constitute about 50% of our populations with high potential, and they're communities where these girls really, really need to be supported to kind of move forward. And I think that's the landscape we are also navigating of how do you really get people to understand that there is not only just a need, but there is a potential and there is an economic imperative to advance or to invest into adolescent girls. Where we stand today, I think we are very ambitious, and we are currently in the process of drafting a pathway for us to work with over 1 million girls by 2030. And we are saying, how do we move from working with 100,000 girls in almost 18 years to working with 1 million girls in the next 5 years? And that's a challenge in the problem statement we are working towards. While we also understand that when we talk about like these million girls, right? And I think just even imagine a picture that you kind of look at, like 1 million girls in rural India that has the confidence to lead, the skills to organize, the networks to influence their decisions. And then imagine what will basically happens to the workforce participation for these girls, right? For gender sensitive governance, for local entrepreneurship, for community resilience. And I know it's a distant dream, it's kind of a challenge, but I think if we see this happening village by village, girl by girl, what we now need to do is to figure out mechanisms to accelerate the momentum of the work that's happening, to bring the same discipline, investment, mindset, and scaling the work that we are basically doing. Also, I think there's a lot of conversation within the country to understand and acknowledge that future is not just urban, and future is just not digital. It's equitable, and and I'm going to leave you with this in terms of the girls like Roshni that we talked about in the speech. They're not looking at just charity or handouts. They're looking at a space to grow, to lead, to build, like most of us, right? Like even our own companies, our own organization, our own families. We're all looking for spaces to grow, lead, and build. But the difference is when these girls do that, they uplift their entire communities. And at Milan, we don't see these girls as just beneficiaries of change. We actually just see them as the architects of India's future. So the question isn't what we can do for the girls. The question is saying, what might we become if we walk besides them? Right? And with that, I'm going to leave you all with the thought process, and happy to answer any questions that comes into. So thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Dhirendra. That's a very compelling story of how at the grassroots level, Milan Foundation is working to bring about the change beyond the feel-good factor, beyond the CSR factor, beyond the empathy factor. I think it is an imperative of business, it's an imperative of growth and economy, and therefore it's a telling story that we all must need to join hands and make this happen. I think that is the compelling pitch you have made today. And you have given us an insight into a strong methodology that you adopted at various levels, and it's a huge landscape that you're dealing with. Your workplace is the future of India, so to say, and the people that you meet are the people that are going to actually shape the future of this country in those numerous villages across various states in India. I think one has to be born with a great deal of strength in mind and the power of the resolve to continue to work and bring about the change, which is quantified as well as in qualitative terms, very, very telling. So proud of you, Mr. Dhirendra, and it's a very strong motivating factor for others also to join the bandwagon and work towards this. Thank you so much for these opening remarks. We will have the Q&A now. I request Professor Prasad to come in and start cluster number one. I'll join back after that for cluster number two. And I request all the participants to write down their questions. We'll open the mic for them to ask the speaker directly in the cluster number two. Over to you, Professor Prasad. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Rao. Thank you, Mr. Dhirendra. It is an amazing journey. I think huge potential, and we need you to grow far more than you are, and we need many more Milans in order to get anywhere close to what the requirement is in reasonable time, so that we reap the demographic dividend in the window that it offers. Let me start with the first question. Your UG is in maths, and from maths you have come a very long way, including doing your PG. So can you tell us more about this journey? What inspired you? How did you enter this, and how do you retain your motivation in such a challenging space, whereas you said only 2% of funding is going into the sector?
Thank you, Dr. Prasad. I think very interesting question. So I grew up in a lower middle class family. My grandparents were farmers. My dad got into the army because somebody had to kind of get a job. And like every other middle class family in this country, the focus was always around education. And as I grew, my plan was very clear, right? Like you do your undergrad from a competitive course, and then go do an MBA. And I actually got into an MBA and then I dropped out from the process, which is a different story. I think what maths really taught me, I think I was always excited about mathematics, and I'm still very excited about mathematics. And I think it's really taught me to look at the data behind the story and the story behind the data, right? Because when you're specifically working in this sector, there is a probability that there is an emotional appeal to work on it. But then when you're looking at where do I want to kind of invest, how do I want to interview, that data is actually telling you a very, very good story. And I can give you a very quick kind of a simple, when Milaan started, it was actually started as an education organization. And we built we just started with a small, a learning center in Sitapur. And it was, as we were building the learning center, I was noticing that there were less girls in school, their attendance was an issue. And so therefore the data kind of comes into, right? As everybody's saying, oh, this is going pretty well, but I'm looking at the data across, I'm saying, and I think when we look at the data, the story always to ask is, who are we leaving behind? Because I think we've just become a generation that we celebrate a lot in terms of people who are progressing, and that we should, because they're the role models, but also asking back and saying, who are we leaving behind? And we were realizing that we were leaving behind a lot of young girls. And that's where our intervention kind of just changed. And I'm still like to look at a lot of decision making from a data lens, because it always helps. So the combination of your head and heart. So I think that's one. I think once I decided to kind of pursue the career and in the nonprofit space, and frankly, nobody in my family or network knew what an NGO was. And I also didn't know what an NGO was. So it just took us a time to kind of get into the journey. But I think, again, when I decided to pursue it for the first couple of years, then that was the time I was like, I need to also professionally upskill myself. And therefore I did the master's in development studies. And then I did a leadership program from IIM Bangalore. I did multiple leadership programs at various stages of my life to make sure that I'm growing as an individual into a career that I'm focusing on and being more impactful here. So I think that's one. To answer your second question, you're right, Dr. Prasad. It's a very challenging environment, right? From various lenses. The funding is very, very limited. You only work in the rural areas, building a kind of team that you need becomes challenging, right? Because a lot of people, the aspiration is to always move to the cities and not to the rural parts. You can do that as a hobby or an internship or a small sabbatical, but that's not what people want to build their careers on. So money is an issue, talent is an issue. But at the same time, I think, and working with the communities in terms of, right, like imagine walking into a community where child marriage is very normal and then suddenly saying like, it's not a good thing to do. And they're like, oh, who are you to tell us? We've been doing this for hundreds of years. And I think, therefore, also kind of working with the very communities to closely to understand how do we really change these mindsets. So it's a challenging space, there's no doubt about that. But at the same time, I think the return on investment is humongous, right? When we work with these girls and I meet them, I see what our work has been able to achieve. I forget all the challenges that we're kind of facing through. Because the reality is, like, when you look back to our parents, right? Our parents spend all their life and all the money that they have and all the talents they have to raise 1, 2, or 3 children. And if those children do well in life, that's their achievement, right? Like that's it. That's how parents probably say we've done well in life. Our children are, and here we have thousands and thousands of them. So I think if you understand the fact that every person that gets supported or every girl that kind of stands up on her feet and make a decision is able to continue her education, goes to college, changes the entire trajectory. I think just experiencing that moment of realization that the impact that your work has created takes away all the pain, right? So yeah, so I would just put it in that sense.
I think great story. Children doing well in life has a huge value to parents. It's incalculable ROI.
Correct.
And I think who we are we leaving behind? That is a very great question that all of us need to ask in whatever we are trying to do, to see whether we are growing, catering to the right segment, producing value where it needs to be produced. So many things. Thank you. I think I also take a cue for the next question, and that's on mindsets. So what kind of mindsets have you encountered with various stakeholder groups, including the funders, when you talk about gender equity and value creation? And how do you put this in your journey over the last 18 years?
Again, very interesting question. I would actually put this into different segments, right? Because when we talk about mindsets, there are 2, 3 things to look at. I think the one question to always understand is that where are we coming from, right? How does our mindsets get built up? Our mindsets gets built up in the ecosystem we grow in. And it could be very simple things, right? So for example, one of the exercises we've started doing was and I'm talking a bit in the community lenses, where we recently started doing some work with boys where we ask boys to start picking up like a simple household work, nothing complex, nothing simple, right? So I'm going to just broom my veranda. And you see the reactions coming from mothers as saying, you're a boy, like, why would you pick up a jhadu? And I think mindsets is really understand where they're coming from. It is intergenerational, it is complex, but at the same time, it is human created. And therefore, you could actually change the mindset. How does mindsets get changed? When people are looking at opportunity, when I'm looking at saying, how does it brings more aspiration, more pleasure, more equity within my own relationships, right? And so I think what we've seen in the communities is that, number one, the country's definitely gone through an aspirational figure, right? Like a phase, right? Like when I started the work in way back in 2007 and in the villages in UP, we actually had to convince parents to say, why they should send their girls to school. There is a time that came where they knew they should send their daughters to school, but they would still not send it. Right? It's an entire journey. And then there are time that comes where when the right to education came in 2021, people start sending their girls to the primary school. So it was a beginning. So what I'm trying to say, that mindset is a change process. And I think to understand that change takes time when it comes to societal structures is important to look at from a community lens. But at the same time, right, it is the fathers and the mothers who are ready to put a hand on their heart and said, I will educate my daughter. I'm going to support. She might be the first one to go to college, but I will go. I have seen fathers who would, spend 1.5 hours going and dropping her up and then 1.5 hours picking her up, right? Like, and these are daily wage earners. So you look at the complexity of what the price people are ready to change to look at aspiration. I think that's important to understand from a mindset perspective. And then there are typical different theories too, right? There's an entire concept of tipping point, which says if you're able to move a community from 25 to 30%, the mindset starts changing very, very quickly. And so that's what you look at specifically when we work in communities. There's an entire concept of what I call it movable middles, right? There are people who are very rigid about a thought process, and there are people who are very liberal about a thought process. But there's a large population, I feel, which sits on the middle, which is not able to decide, right? They're like, do I want to do this? Do I not want to do this? And I think those are the people too easy to support to move to a direction, right? So that's on the one end. I think on the the other end, which is the complex end, which is the donor end, I would say the funders end, it becomes further complex because I think our appetite to look at success and impact has decreased. Right? So everybody is looking at those short-term goals. So like even if you look at CSR, right? A CSR is generally looking at anything between like a 1 year, if you get lucky, then a 3-year project. And if I go back to the example that I brought in, Dr. Prasad, of around like raising your children, it's a long-term impact. You can't expect to walk into a community and within 12 months, the community just changes the way they kind of look at, and every girl in school. It doesn't happen that way. It doesn't happen with our own children, right? Like if we want them to kind of convince them to kind of move to a certain things, there's a lot of work that happens. I think to understand that change takes time, structures takes time, and to understand that what we're investing into is a long-term investment is something to kind of really look at. That's number one. Number two is, I think when we talk about women and girls, it becomes a very women and girls issue. I can't tell you how many times I have gone into a donor meeting and after the gentleman has heard about what we do, they'll be like, "Oh, this is a women and girls cause. You should talk to my wife," right? And I think the direction and the decision kind of changes. And I think it is also like I was talking about in my talk. It's very important to understand that it is everybody's issue. It is not a women and girls issue, and therefore, as people who have the potential to drive change or drive decision making at any stages of our lives, it's important to understand again, how do we sincerely make sure that our investments, both financial and non-financial, are able to include the most vulnerable in the circle, which currently I see vulnerable, like girls from specifically vulnerable communities. It definitely becomes the most vulnerable, right? Like in this, and just that slight awareness helps to make the investment. That being said, I think I've also seen that there are donors who are willing to go on that journey. And it's a journey, right? And then kind of really understand through the work, being very patient and saying, look, I'm going to just take a couple of years to understand how this works and see the impact. And then I've seen how they've kind of now converted into long-time donors, right? So I do think that gender equity has to looked at for everybody. And specifically in countries like India, where gender equity is largely focused on women and girls, we should be looking at creating more and more spaces, investing in more and more girls. And I always like joke about this, but it's also a reality. A lot of us actually, when people get awards, if you listen to their speeches, they're like, "Oh, I want to thank my mother." And then I always say, is like, how do you invest into a space where that girl can actually become a mother to another successful person, right? Because that's how intergenerational changes moves. And I think that's the question we have to ask ourselves in long term and investing in girls. And it takes time at this end also to kind of change that mindset.
Excellent. I think you have given a large landscape there when you talked about mindset. And I think the poignant part was when you talked about donors who are supposed to be more in India than in Bharat, and they themselves have a mindset issue. I think that sums up the whole issue. And perhaps what you've achieved in rural India is perhaps far more in terms of the impact than perhaps the donors have done in terms of what India has given. That's great. And the other thing which I appreciate is that the impact fact. I think you've been measuring impact. This is one question that we have in almost many of our social ventures, and you have put it very upright. You've talked about school drop rates being only 5% versus 40%. You talked about sexual and reproductive health matters, awareness 96 versus 28. Everything is very neatly captured. And I think, you have understood and really so that donors or many other stakeholders will look at impact at the end of the day, because it's a very complex problem and people want to know whether you are concentrated on the core. So now I come to the next question, which is related to all these, multiple areas that you are into and you are showing up impact. Now it looks like a multi-pronged initiative. So when you look at it that way, how do you organize such a framework? I mean, how did you get to organize this? Because it could have been much more complex, and you've chosen some 4 points, and then you've concentrated and built your organization and your initiative around. How did you do that? That is one question. And within this, what drives the impact? Within these 4 too, what are the critical parameters?
So I would definitely say it's been a journey. Right? And I think when we look at data, it is important to look at data in a social impact space, as I said earlier, is because what we experience from our heart is more qualitative impact, right? But then when you really look at the question I asked the team was, what is that common minimum denominator? Which means, let's say if I'm going to work with 1,000 girls, you can always come back to me and say, like, these 5 girls, Aisha is doing this and Roshni is doing this and Rajni is doing this, and that's great. But what is that common minimum denominator? We're going to say, like, all 1,000 girls will show impact at this level, right? Because that's how I'm going to look at the return on investment. And I'm generally very consciously using these terms because it is important to understand that, right? Like, what is that delta? Even if it's a small delta, if it means that I'm going to make sure that a girl, if the data shows that there is a high probability of a girl to drop out from grade 6 to 7th, and I'm going to just make sure that I'm going to bring that dropout less by 10%, it's fine. But I think that defines the benchmark in, like, any corporate business setup, right? Well, benchmark that's saying all the girls will have that minimum denominator, right? And I think with that lens, when we were looking at more research and trying to really understand what are those major milestones in one's life that makes a break, right? So the first milestone definitely to look at is if the girl is school dropout, depending on the stage of the school dropout. But we all know that the moment she drops out, the domestic labor increases, her learning stops, growth stops, and therefore in a couple of years, or depending on the age, the parents start looking at getting her a marriage. So then she becomes a child bride. She becomes a child bride, could be like a 16, 17, if she's lucky, have an early child, her health gets impacted, the child's get impacted, and the circle kind of just continues, right? And therefore, in that life cycle approach, we look at those points as saying, can we delay and address those? So if you look at our first indicator, for example, is continuation and completion of secondary education. How do we ensure that the girls we work on the program are able to continue and complete? And I think that's where it comes into, because we realize that the moment we are able to do this, right? Like, on average, for example, the average age of a girl completing class 12th in India is about 17 years. So if you make sure that we are able to get her to clear class 12th, not only is she's academically more stronger to kind of pursue a career, but we know we've avoided child marriage. Generally, girls who are in school are not become child brides, right? Like, we've avoided her kind of, becoming an early, like a teenage mother. So that becomes an important indicator to then measure an impact, right? And so that was first. The second is around child marriage, very specifically saying, how do we delay child marriage? And so even if she's in school, how do we have conversations in the communities to delay child marriage? How do we track every girl in our program? I use the football analysis of doing that one-to-one mapping of really understand every girl and saying, what's going on in a family? How do we convince the family to not make a decision? Who in the community can convince her? It could be not me, right? It could be like the village pradhan who can go and have a cup of tea and say, thoda sa aur padhne do bacche ko. Right? And it changes. And we've seen, like, a small conversation changes the parents' mindset. Think, okay, pradhan ji keh rahe to karne deta. And I think how do you do that is the second piece that I would basically look at. Health, again, like, adolescent is where a lot of health parameters changes, not around sexual and reproductive health, which is very, very critical, but also how do you build that self well-being, a self sense of it? How do I take care of myself? Because that's also a mindset that we were talking about, Dr. Prasad, is women and girls in India, generally in rural parts specifically, are grown up with saying they really are very invisible, and their job is to just take care of their husbands, their children, their brothers, and other people. They're not stepping back and thinking about, what do I like, right? One of my favorite scenes from this movie, Lapata Ladies, is where the mother-in-law actually says, oh, I really like this dish, but nobody else likes it. The men in the house don't like, so I don't cook it. And the bride says, why don't you cook it? And she's like, oh, now will we make food as per women's choices? And that's the reality. It's a very subtle reality. And therefore, it is very important to understand that the adolescent health for that girl is going to be saying, how do I take care of myself, right? How do I take care of my menstruation? How do I talk about, where do I get pads from? How do I know how to manage it? How do I make my own choices in terms of, when I have a sexual partner, or when do I want to have a child? Things like that. My own nutrition. In rural parts, luckily, if you're aware, there is so many nutritive stuffs that's available, right? Luckily, we don't have the pizzas and the burgers still reaching there. So there's healthy food that one can kind of hop on. And in the entire process, as I said, the major answer to understand is, how do we drive the awareness around gender issues, gender sensitization around it? Sometimes just to understand it is not normal. For example, gender-based violence. One of my initial work that I'd done in my career was I was part of a research project in Rajasthan. This is way back in my master's. And it was a domestic violence project. And we were in the villages, and the women were looking at our face and saying, why are you talking about it? Mard hai, marega. He's a man, he's going to hit me. I don't have a problem with it. Why do you have a problem with it? If you can help me with something, help me how to make some more money, how to save money, things like that, right? And the 18, 19-year-old me was always kind of questioning, saying, is how is it normal? Like, how do we come to a stage where it is acceptable for somebody to hit me just because he's my husband, right? And therefore, when you look at the fourth indicator, we realize that if we want that girl to be in school and learning well, if we want her to be healthy, it is important for her to be able to recognize that there's the matter of self-worth, there's a matter of agency, and the fact that she matters, right? And we live in a democratic country, and there's a constitution that protects them too, right? I think when you build that framework, so when you really look at data, I think from that, like Dr. Prasad, our has been a very organic journey to really understand the life cycle approach. What are those major break-in points in one's life that one need to track and support the process of transition? And therefore, how do we look at data in terms of the impact that has created, in terms of those transition points?
I think it's a fantastic value chain, heavily invested with life, and you've built from one to the other. Thank you very much. In these three questions, you've covered quite a bit, and I hand it over to Professor Rao for many more questions.
Thank you very much. That's a very interesting conversation going on. I'll start with one simple question, and that is, you have achieved a reduction of 98% in child marriages in your communities. So whatever you have seen is working on the ground. Is there anything that the policy makers might be missing? What is that they are missing?
I think it's an interesting question because India is one of the few countries globally that has a child marriage issue, like in terms of the data set. But at the same time, at policy level, we are very solid, right? We are not like the Child Marriage Act is pretty old. It came decades ago. And I think the question that one would have really asked is that one is that we're building a law, and the other is the implementation piece of it. And then in implementation, there are two pieces. One is when you force the implementation of something, right? It's just like as simple as, I'm not comparing child marriages with traffic light, but just kind of giving an example, right? Like if you have a traffic light system, you jump the traffic light, or if you don't wear a helmet, you have to pay a fine, right? And so there is a system of saying, forcing that or reinforcing that, like the traffic guy standing everywhere who's charging you money, blah, blah, blah. And then there is a second piece where the government actually goes to schools and colleges and young people and like generally public and creates more awareness around why is it good for themselves to wear a helmet, right? Because we have maximum. I think if you look at a similar story, child marriage has always been very part of our Indian culture. And I think when you are trying to uproot a cultural thing, there is a complexity because one has to understand that you can't just force it, right? Like we can't just put police guys to everywhere and saying like, identify every marriage that is happening and do this and do that. It's a sudden mindset that needs to be brought in. So I think I'm not very sure in terms of, I think there is the enforcement piece which is there. I think what needs to be done is to really identify, which the government is actually doing in many of the programs. And the Mission Shakti by the central government recently has been kind of Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao has been a lot of focus around those things. So there's been a massive campaigns to really identify. Now, I think something to also understand is that we might have to look back and look at some of the data again, because this child marriage again is happening in very specific pockets in the country, right? And specifically around the aspirational districts that the government has identified. I do think that what the government and in terms of policy and the other players needs to do is to go very like in a surgical way to identify pockets where the rates are very, very high. And the population with demographics where the rates are very high. It could be very cultural in nature, religion in nature, economics in nature. And then see how do we intervene there with a mix of building the reinforcing system, but also building more awareness with the community. And really trying to understand, like I was talking to Dr. Prasad, was triggers that can help navigate it, right? So things like, how do we make sure more girls are in school? Especially at the secondary division, right? So, and primary, we know that the government is now showing that almost 97% of our girls are in school in the primary. But in secondary, that number drops significantly, right? So how do we make sure that a transition happens very, very quickly? So I think mindsets is where we need more community work to happen and more dialogue to happen. But going a very surgical way might help to eliminate a lot of these issues from the roots.
Great. So the answer lies in the fact that the government needs to focus in a sharp approach in the pockets where the rise in child marriages or other parameters is actually rising. And then that's the solution that you propose. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Right. The related point here is In the entirety of your work with the communities in villages in the rural part of this country over the last 18 years, can you identify the challenges that you have faced from the vested interests? The vested interest could come from any agency. It could be from the societal norms itself or societal structures itself. It could be from any other structure which is not societal. It could be political. It could be corporate related. We don't know. I just wanted to ask you, what are those impediments that came through vested interests? Because you're actually working at the grassroots level that you would have encountered.
I think the first thing to also understand, like in terms of the first thing that I would have got to focus on is the fact that when we talk about norm change and mindset change, it's very political in nature. Right? Specifically in a country like India, where politics is very religion and caste driven. Like we would love to be in a place where people are voting for development, but we still know that there's a large population that votes in the name of religion, caste, things like that. And therefore, the moment we talk about norm change, they also becomes part of, and especially women and girls, they become part of the politics, right? So for example, if you say there are more child marriages in the Dalit community, there might be a discussion. So local community leaders say like, you're targeting us and you're talking about us along. And there could be other factors too. So I think understanding that, there is the women's movement used to say personal is political. And I think understanding that and understanding that how do you acknowledge who are the leaders within that community systems and how does that impact them helps you navigate some of the challenges. It's a very complex navigation. It's not easy. There is a benefit for like, in the structures that we live in, actually, like when Milan was started, and I think when I had the opportunity to be a part of the fellowship program, actually, worked in Uttarakhand in a rural village. And the question I was asking was, do we systematically want these children not to be very educated so that they grow up, become the drivers and the mates that we want as middle class? Because and I think that systematic question has to be answered. And that's where the challenge is, specifically with women and girls. There is a lot of systematic questions. And then the donors, even the educated people ask me saying, oh, if the girls becomes leaders, or if she starts, like I've heard one statement I've heard, which irritates me a lot, is basically saying, oh, अगर वो बहुत बोलने लग जाएगी तो उसकी शादी कैसे हो? And I think even with the educated perspective in Indian like mindset, a marriage is a very big aspect. And so people are worried about saying, if she gets educated, where will she get married? If she's going to speak a lot, where does she get married? Will be she able to adjust with in-laws? What will happen? And I think when you look at like the power dynamic around it is sometimes I'm just wondering like, what do we want? Because what everybody is scared at from the top to bottom, and when I say top bottom and not the hierarchy, but just from let's say the ruler, both Bharat and India divide, it's do not disturb the equilibrium. And mindset change is all about that, right? And there is a lot of research that actually shows that smaller things kind of just adds up. So I would just put it in that regard, right? Across the board, people building narratives around things. I've heard from many people recently in the last few years of saying, oh, now that more and more girls, like when they look at, like, for example, board results, and like, oh, there are more girls who are clearing class 10th from government schools, which is also reality. And then they're like, oh, but the boys are being left behind. And now we need a boys empowerment program. And I'm not saying anything is right or wrong, but I'm just trying to say is that there is a system that gets built and then everybody's comfortable with the system. The moment you start unweaving the system, people starts getting uncomfortable because their position moves, both in a good way or a bad way. And to understand those vested interests takes a lot of complexities. And I'm not sure we have an answer to it, but I do think that we are a little more aware about it now when we work in the communities to really understand who are we disturbing, or both from a good end and who's going to be moving now, right? Like who's going to get comfortable or uncomfortable in that sense. And we had issues with people saying, why are these girls sitting in a circle or like in a public space? So in the village, when we are doing meetings with the girls, like they're like, oh, why is this happening? Or why is she going to Lucknow to attend a training with girls traveling? And sometimes it's the parents, but most of the times it's the relatives, and it is the village head, and it's just the caste head, and I think there's a lot of politics that kind of just goes into. And while politics is not just the electoral politics, but it's also the other politics going on.
I'm completely with you, Mr. Dhirendra. I think it's a very, very complex set of impediments that impact your work. When I say impact your work, impacts everyone's work, actually speaking. The structures which are political, socio-political in nature to start with, and everyone looks at this development or change in terms of mobility, in terms of displacement, in terms of comfort zones being affected. Yes, therefore, it is pretty difficult to build in a level of acceptance for this. And in the absence of a positive, generous acceptance, change doesn't become generative. So that's the impediment. So I think that many challenges are there. And I am completely with you when you said that it is complex. Let's move to the next question, Mr. Dhirendra. The next question is, you have framed the topic of girl equity, gender equity as an issue of global south. So what are the lessons that we have from other countries in the global south, or Milan's templates being attempted in other countries as well? What's the outlook in that area?
So currently we've just actually, from the global south perspective, again, interesting stats, right? About 600 million girls live in the global south and huge potential. And when I say global south, we've also seen a lot of empowerment models actually coming from north just the thing, right? So there's a model that gets designed in the US, in the Canadas, in the Europes of the world. And then it's bring it down to countries like India, Bangladesh, countries in Africa. There are very few models that we've seen actually this come from a south to south link of saying it has worked in the south, global south, and we want to look at. And Girl Icon program, I think, considering that we generated so much of evidence, the question we were really asking was that what is the possibility of then taking a model like this to the global south and understanding where the complexities are? So the first country that we intervened is Uganda. We've done a pilot with approximately about 1,000 girls in 2 districts in Uganda. With again, Uganda, only 20% of the girls go to secondary school. And understanding that when you move to a new country, like the cultural context is very different, the vocabulary is very different. Something really funny happened with me in the training is like when we work with the girl icons in India, we talk about girl icons building peer groups. And I actually didn't knew that peer groups by concept in Uganda is actually a negative connotation to it. It's like, you have a and therefore just the vocabulary has to change, the curriculum has to change. But I think the model of the core of the thing that how do we invest in girls' leadership and girls' voices remains the same. So Uganda is the first country we've kind of building on to, and hopefully, with our dream of our ambition of working with 1 million plus, we might be looking at other countries as we go along and figure out the funding scenarios.
Excellent. Before I take the question from the audience, one small I think you have touched upon it briefly, but in this mindset shifting process, how is this factor of male allyship changing? Are there any notable lessons for us? I think it's applicable not just in the rural area, it's applicable even in the non-rural area, but at least some lessons from there in the communities that you are working.
I think it's definitely changing because I think, the 2 things that is happening is number 1, from an aspiration perspective, right? In cities and urban, obviously, people want an educated partner. Even in the rural areas, now boys are getting more and more aspirational of having a more educated partner. And I think they're also navigating to understand what does it mean to have a person who has a voice, right? Who is basically would have their own opinions, will have their own choices, and let's just say acknowledging that there'll be a generation of change from what they've seen their mothers play a role in the house as a housewife, as somebody as a house manager, to what they would expect their wife to do. And I think that there's a beauty to see that. I see there has been, we've started a boys program too now. And a lot of boys, it started in 2021, came to me with the same kind of a notion of saying there are challenges, right? And there are complexities, and nobody talks to boys about those things. And boys don't talk to boys about those things too. So I think the allyship is kind of changing because people are seeing the strength of it. They're seeing the strength of, both partners playing almost equal roles in the family. When it comes to, bringing money home, to taking care of children, to taking care of households. That being said, I think it's a long journey to go.
Yeah.
Even in the middle class in the urban cities, right? We all have been to families, or could be our families, but could be all been to knows our neighbors and stuff, where a man will always ask his wife, can you give me a glass of water? He's not going to get up and get a glass of water. And I think it's a very simple things like this of saying how do we create spaces? And I know there are campaigns that was run into where reality in most of the urban India now, both the husband and wife works. They both come from work, but then what happens after that, right? The wife gets into the kitchen to make sure there's dinner. And even if you have house help, like, she's responsible for making sure the house is into the place, and the guy basically switches on the TV and watches news and have a nice dinner and have a conversation. And I think that's where the challenges still comes into, is saying it's a different level of complexity when it comes to gender equity, but to really understand what it means to be an equal partner in a relationship is a question that a lot of young men are asking. And I think they're also trying to figure it out from wherever they can, actually, through programming, through learning, through reading. And there's definitely more sensitization is what I see.
Thank you.
But it's
Thank
a
you.
long way to go.
Yeah, I think it is very encouraging to hear from you that it is changing. Male allyship is actually working because of the fact that it is in their interest also to have the aspiration of a valued partner as they grow up and as they would like to have the life with. So fantastic. Can we take this question from Dr. Anita Raman? Over to you, Dr. Anita.
I congratulate, Dr. Rao and also Dr. Prasad for bringing such a valuable conversation. Thank you so much, Dharmendra ji, for doing such a wonderful work. My question would remain, when you have such a, huge work doing from the heart, and we know that you're contributing so much, but on the finances front, we find that the way more should have been done, or as Dr. Rao was mentioning, as a part of CSR responsibility, the companies are supposed to, invest into the funds. Can there be a leeway wherein the tax rebates can be given for the impact funding, for the kind of work that you're doing? That was one question. And second thing would be, can we make this model more sustainable? These girls are contributing so much, in terms of their growth. What is the value proposition, or how much is that value add that you can derive once they, giving it back or making it more sustainable so that, your work can grow? Those are two things that I had in my mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Raman. Yeah, very thought-provoking questions. I'm going to respond to the first one. I think there's already a tax rebate in India for donations to charitable causes like us. So under ATG, almost 50% of the donation amount gets tax exempted, which is the maximum allowed in India. Interestingly, countries like the US, that tax exemption is almost about 100%, and I think that could be one journey that, at the policy level, maybe one day somebody would look at, saying, how do we make and there were special projects. There are still special projects that the government of India allows for 100% tax exemption, and I'm hoping that there would be discussions to say, how do you prioritize those? But currently, there is a 50% tax rebate. That's number one. Number two is, I think, on terms of financing, we're also realizing that when we look at institutional financing from things like CSR or government funding or international foundations, they might have more, like, in terms of things. But I do think that the main power for financing of causes like us would be depending on the people, right? The power of many is what is going to be coming into smaller amount. So, for example, in Milan's case, it's cost about 3,500 rupees to support a girl to go through a leadership program over 18 months. And we were able to achieve this from a very, very scalable notion, right? And initially our cost was much higher. Now, but when you think about the fact is, like, 3,500 is what you would spend for dinner when you go out today. And I think those are the questions that people would have to ask, saying, how can we support? Because it is a people's movement. It is not so much, it is as much as policy and things like that. It is a people's movement, because to Dr. Raw's point, the moment you get institutional involved, there is vested interest that kind of dictates how they will be investing into, right? So a CSR will think about, is it in my geography? Am I talking about my own beneficiaries? And there could be various other factors. It is my company's interest. The government is looking at another angle, the institution looking at another angle. But I think it's people like you and me who can actually create a larger difference, if you ask me, into supporting causes. And we've seen many successful projects in the country, which has happened because of people's support. The second thing on sustainability, we do have a larger piece of the alumni program where the girls actually give back. They don't give back financially. We didn't feel it was right for them because they've just started their career. So many of them don't make very significant smaller amount of money into the geographies they work. But what they actually give is much more than money, which is their own time. So almost 80% of our teams for the Girl Icon program is actually the alumni from the program. And they kind of come in as mentors, they come in as guidance supporters, even trainers, wherever kind of required to build a landscape that helps us with scale. And actually, they're one of the, combined with technology, they've been one of our force of how we've been able to scale up, almost like a 6 to 7 times in the last 3 to 4 years.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Mr. Dhirendra. I have another question before anybody raises their hand. That is about your Swarachna school and the hostel. In your value chain, what is the logic or the idea behind establishing this?
So Milan actually started from the school. So our journey actually started from the school, right? As I talked to the fact, we built a small learning center in a community. There was no school. So the community came together, said, can we build a school? Because there was none in almost like a 13-kilometer radius that time. Now there are some more schools. This is 18 years back. So I would say the school remains the heart of what we do, because we've learned from there. We've grown from there. And it has actually built our knowledge, our confidence, and our networks to be able to work with larger geographies. So today also, school in a way, I would say remains the heart, because like the saying goes, you should always know where you come from. And so we come from that rural village in Sitapur where we built the school.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Thank you very much for that. One question that I have been wanting to ask you even before we start this conversation is, do you live in US? So you live in US because you have access to the donors and funders, or is it a decision that it will create better impact to drive these activities by staying in India? How did you decide on this dilemma?
Frankly, it was a very personal decision. It was one of the post-COVID things when me and my wife were saying, what are the things that we want to do in our lives before something happens? Because, there were a lot of happening. And one of the things my wife said actually was that she always wanted to do her PhD. And so she's actually doing her PhD at the Michigan State University, which is what made us to kind of move to the US for time being. So it was not a very organizational strategic thing. I think what we are now trying to do is the fact that we know that we are here and PhD is a 5-year program. How do we make most of the time, or how do I make most of the time in the US to be able to build a network, mobilize more resources for India, create spaces to talk to the Indian diaspora? But the decision to move has been very personal in that sense. And we don't know we are long-term or short-term. Like, we moved here. COVID had made all of us to make some decisions in life, and this was one of ours.
Amazing, amazing. Wish you all the best while you're staying there and learning a little more. Keep driving the effort that you have already been at in the rural India and India that matters to all of us. I'm very happy.
Thank you so much.
This is a pretty satisfying conversation that we have had just now. It's not that the questions are over, but I'll pause here and reflect on what we have gathered from you. And if there are other questions, of course, I'll write to you so that you can reply at your convenience. But what is more importantly a concern for this conversation is to capture the landscape of what you're doing and what are the different agencies, impediments, and what are the roles and responsibilities that people like us who are around the screen to pick up so that we become an aid in your work, we support in your work, and also we try towards expanding that appetite for success, which you mentioned. So probably you can answer that in a line saying, what can institutions like us, where we are into higher education, we have universities across the country, in North and South and Pan-India, we have in 20 locations almost, and large number of students and faculty. We push a different kind of agenda, which is also developmental. We are a private organization working for public good. Where can we partner? How can we partner? What should we do? Maybe 1 or 2 pointers at that would help us.
No, thanks, Dr. Rao. I think this is definitely a very enriching conversation for me too. And I really appreciate the opportunity. I would say as educational institutions, I would just specifically put a couple of things very, very quickly. Number one is to build awareness, right? As you're building the next generation of leaders, who will be working in corporates and governance and other places in the world. How do we create more awareness about the fact that, there is a Bharat which is getting more and more invisible? Believe me, I walked into meetings in Bangalore and Delhi where people are like, oh, we have child marriage? I don't know which India you're talking about, because they're not even aware about it, right? So I think just building an awareness about what we are leaving behind or who we are leaving behind into the setups, and probably organizing and inviting more people would be a good idea to look at. I would say just building an awareness so that when they go into a position of power, they can exercise it. That's number one. Number two is, I don't know if you have the resources, but to kind of also think about if there are ways for ICFAI to kind of support some of these girls to come to college, from these remote parts of the country and be those first generation learners, be the first generation engineer, be like we have a college scholarship program that we run for many of these girls, but our resources are very, very limited. But I kind of also think about saying, like, even if I want to pick up 5 girls, 10 girls that I want to support them to do a free education in a college setup, or could be something to look at. The third thing is, if there are locations or geographies you're working, you have university campuses and we have offices or projects, we'd love to also kind of, partner to see what we can do with the students, both in terms of internships, exposure trips, combine projects together. There is so much that one can do, depending on the intent and the space.
There is intent and there is space, and we are probably overlapping in some of the areas where our universities exist and your offices coexist. I think there's a great deal of possibility of working together. Apart from scholarships, apart from those obvious things, the internships is a pretty interesting factor. This immersive internship at an early stage in their life will make them much more sensitive and also build up a sense of caring, a sense of contributing and giving back to the society, and probably that stays with them for a longer time to come. I think it's a good initiative to start in our institutions. Although we have clubs and we have activities, but internships will be a major activity to consider, and we'll be quite open to doing that, Mr. Dhirendra. I think if you open the website, we are there in all parts of the country. And for example, we have universities in Dehradun, we have in Himachal, Baddi, we are in Jaipur, we are in Ranchi, Raipur, apart from Hyderabad, Bangalore, Mumbai, Pune, Kolkata, and all those metro cities. I'm talking about non-metros. We are also there hugely present in Northeast, especially Meghalaya, Mizoram, Nagaland, Tripura, and Sikkim. So everywhere, I'm sure this agenda needs to be pushed, and we need methodologies that are working, that are adopted by people like you, especially you. And we need to work hand in hand towards creating this appetite for success and measuring ourselves. Who are we leaving behind? I think that is one thought that will go with us this evening and stays with us for a long, long time to come. Who are we leaving behind? I think it is not just a term that's applicable in social sphere that you are working, but even in the business sphere as well. Who are the customers we are leaving behind? I think untargeted customers that we are leaving behind because of improper targeting, improper focusing, lack of data, and lack of insight. I think we can be much more empathetic, whether it is in business or in social work, like the way you are working on. I think leaving behind, who are we leaving behind, is a greater metric to go by. That's the spirit to go by, actually. Thank you so much today for your time, patience, and energy in explaining all these things to us, Mr. Dhirendra. Wish you good luck, and wish you greater opportunities to create this impact. Continue to deepen this, and wherever it's possible, we are going to join hands. And more than saying, I think more than the intent, we should be measured by the action, and that's where we meet. So let's create some kind of action on the ground with your help, with your methodology and apparatus that's prevailing already.
Thank you so much, Mr. Roy, and thank you so much, Dr. Prasad. This has been a great opportunity. I love the conversation. I love the spirit. I think we need more and more institutions like ICFAI to come forward and indulge in dialogues in terms of how do we actually, keep the Bharat in the forefront of our thought processes, our interventions, and create future leaders that are going to be really understanding how do we make a more inclusive India, which is preparing for the 2047 being a superpower. Yeah.
Amazing.
So,
amazing.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I urge everyone who are present today. A large number of people have joined today. I have seen people joining from various walks of life, leaders unto themselves, leaders in the making, leaders learning, and leaders teaching. All of them have joined. One pattern has emerged from this discussion, and that is very, very important. It is, we have seen change makers making change makers. The Girl Icon program is a very important thing where icons are making more icons are making more leaders. The alumni are coming back to support your activity and take it forward. Boys are becoming men and the girls are growing into powerful women. I think this is the lesson that we have learned from the fantastic activity that you are doing. And it is not a feel good imperative. It is not a feel good or politically correct kind of a statement that one is trying to make by doing this work, but it is a growth imperative. It is an imperative which pushes us to always balance between the economic strides that the country is making overall vis-a-vis the developmental strides at the grassroots level that we are supposed to make. I think a better balance between these two is the lesson that we have to draw from today's conversation and the great deal for us to learn. Please go and check the website. The impact stories are pretty interesting. Every girl is a story. From Roshni to many more, I'm sure we'll join hands to build a greater country, and the impact that every girl is making because of the developmental moves that are happening to her in her life, and also creating the self-esteem in every single girl. I'm sure the country's self-esteem also will go up. Thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen. See you next Friday at the same time with yet another learning and a leader like Mr. Dhirendra coming and talking to us. Thank you all. Have a great weekend and good night.
Namaste.